Hi, my name is Pamela Walker, and this is the legal history of EB education research. So for this assignment, I picked six different kind of time periods, court cases throughout history that I chose to highlight, starting with the Myers versus Nebraska case, then the Civil Rights Act, the Lau versus Nichols, Flores versus Arizona, the No Child Left Behind Act, and then the Arizona Senate Bill 1014. So I'd like to start out with the Myers versus Nebraska Act. This was in 1923. This act kind of struck home for me as my grandpa grew up in a coal mining town in West Virginia with his primary language, him being from immigrant descent, is German. So this case where it was went to the Supreme Court where a teacher in Nebraska was teaching a 10-year-old German from the Bible. And this was during anti-German sentiments during World War II and World War I. The Supreme Court found that banning the teaching of a foreign language threatened the 14th Amendment, but at the same time, during that time, although it maintained immigrant rights, there was still such anti-German sentiments that immigrant groups felt strong pressure to assimilate. It led to bilingual education by the late 1930s that was virtually eradicated throughout the U.S. And I always wondered why my family kind of didn't speak German after, my grandpa who grew up speaking it in his home. And I'm guessing that this is the reason that anti-German sentiments during that time period. So I thought that was kind of an interesting personal connection. The second one I chose to highlight was the Civil Rights Act. This was in 1964. The primary focus was not language education, but enforcing anti-discrimination policies did empower language services and discrimination based on limited English. So what the Civil Rights Act did was open the door to prohibit all forms of discrimination based on race, color, national origin, including limited English. It required schools to provide language services. It ensured equal access to education regardless of immigration status, and schools to identify English language learners. It also required schools to communicate with parents in their native language, and federal funding threats to keep the enforcement of these ideas in place. The next one I chose to highlight was the Supreme Court case, Lau versus Nichols in 1974. Basically, there was a group of non-English Chinese in San Francisco that sued for adequate language development services. It established the right of students to treatment based on their language minority status. And I really like this quote from the case. It says, "No inequality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum for students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education." So I think it really brought up the idea of equality versus equity that has started in 1974. The parents ended up forming an advisory committee based on the Supreme Court ruling to kind of address the concerns, and it made a gateway for what they called the Lau remedies, which mandated school districts with greater than 5% minority students to offer language instruction. The next court case I chose to focus on was Flores versus Arizona. This was in 1992, where a group of parents in Nogales, Arizona, sued against the state, claiming inadequate language services and insufficient funding. The court fines were kind of astronomical. It was $21 million per day. It resulted in the English language learning students not having to follow the same guidelines as regular students in the classroom with the Ames graduation requirements. The court case was in the court so long that by the time it was settled, they ruled that the Arizona had made sufficient improvements to the language services. So it didn't really affect the parents initially, but I do think it paved the way for future students in Arizona. The next act was the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. Some of the things that really impacted English learners were the testing that are required because of testing in grades 3 through 8, as well as once in high school. They were allowed to see what kind of testing was among English learners, how they were testing. and then they can focus improvements specifically on English learners. One of the side things that it did, it limited but did not prohibit bilingual education, but it was pretty limited. And the final case I'm highlighting is the Arizona Senate Bill 1014. It reduced the standard requirements for English language learners from 4 hours to 2 hours. And it kind of maybe found a loophole for bilingual education opportunities to improve. And dual immersion programs to re-exist in the state because they could qualify for SEI models. I think this was very interesting to kind of go through all these cases to see the progression as well the changes that need to take place for future changes to be made and kind of see where the direction language education is headed currently. So thank you. Here are the list of documents.